chit-chatting in the ranks. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and Portolano chartists, I'm very happy to tell you that we have greetings from our YouTube followers, no doubt in thousands, but one of them, Catherine Delano-Smith, has very kindly written to say that the YouTube is working very well, and she thanks Joaquim and Anna and the team for putting it on. She also sends greetings to those of you that she has managed to recognise in YouTube. Anyway, enough of that. Our first speaker is Tony Campbell, and I'm going to refrain from introducing him, and I'm going to go away and give him the full 30 minutes. Tony.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for not giving a full account of my former misdeeds. Right. Just.
Oh, sorry. I need to say something else. Sorry, Tony.
Yeah.
I was instructed, and I forgot, as usual. When you have the microphone to ask Tony a question, and please begin to think about them now, will you please hold the microphone near to your mouth so that we can actually record it for YouTube? Thank you. Sorry, Tony.
Not at all. I hope I've got it in the right place, because it doesn't seem to want to go any higher than that. Let me just do this. This talk concerns an untold aspect of the portolan chart story, one away from its life at sea. We will be looking at how the chart's coastal outlines, which simultaneously define the sea boundaries of provinces, eventually gain prominence in land-based cartography. The focus will be on those areas that were covered by a 14th century portolan chart. Now, this is a synopsis of a long essay to be published later this year. A 30-minute talk must therefore be selective. Since the contrast between the outlines of the portolan charts and Ptolemaic cartography will be central to this talk, it may help to remind ourselves about the differences, and I apologize for those for whom all this is going to be fully understood already. This slide homes in on the most useful feature for distinguishing the competing outlines, namely that of North Africa. Please take a moment to memorize the Carte-Pisan line, which, when compared with what we now know to be true, is unique in reproducing the climb up to Tunisia and then the abrupt fall down into the Gulf of Sirte. This outline is clearly visible from space. The difference between the outlines on the maps drafted on the base of the Ptolemaic coordinates, it's the top line, and the actual pattern is striking. Where the coastline should climb, the Ptolemaic maps show it falling. Incorrect latitude readings for the western half of the North African coast were the cause of this error. In the images that follow, you will frequently see the contrasting outlines of the portolan chart and Ptolemaic geography. Other prominent indicators that a Ptolemaic source is involved were the distortions to the British Isles and Italy. Of course, the portolan charts created and perpetuated errors of their own. One example is the treatment of the Black Sea, where the southeast corner was swung up to the north, when in reality the sea's southern corners are on the same latitude, and that was not corrected for a very long time. The first instance of a portolan chart's outlines being used in a world map was Marina Sanudo's well-known small circular map of about 1320. And please note that all maps have been turned to the north for our convenience. Although the charts provided the outlines for the heart of that map, the portolan detail had to be drastically simplified. Some chart makers took the opportunity to extend their coverage to the east, in the process creating a chart-based mappa mundi. There were a number of these, but the contrast between two of them, the Catalan Atlas and the Catalan Estense world map, is revealing. Both were drawn in Mallorca and by chart makers, respectively Cresc Abraham and Petrus Rosselli. Cresc Abraham clearly sought to present a seamless whole between the two portolan chart panels and the matching pair to the right, without visible change in the cartographic language. Rosselli, on the other hand, conveys, however subtly, the difference between the Black Sea, which is included in the portolan chart, and the Caspian Sea, which was not. He does so by following the portolan chart convention of leaving the body of the Mediterranean and Black Seas entirely blank, but then adds wavy lines elsewhere, for example, the Caspian and the Baltic. Not surprisingly, the rediscovery of Ptolemy's geographical coordinates and the maps drawn on that base had a negative role to play in the wider adoption of the portolan chart's outlines. Versions of Ptolemy's Geographia, illustrated with a world map, had been circulating since at least the 14th century. But it was the translation of the Geographia's text from Greek into Latin about 1406 that led to a significant increase in the work's circulation. The process of exposing the literati to Ptolemaic geography in the original form reached its apogee with the publication of 4 versions of those maps in the 5 years after 1477. There was a limited updating of the Ptolemaic outlines, for example, replacing the distorted British Isles with contemporary versions, often those from the portolan charts. However, even if some of the Geographia's regional maps started to be paired with new versions that were, at least partly, based on the portolan charts, the world map remained unaltered. When seen as part of Eurasia, the extent of the original portolan chart coverage was greatly exaggerated. In reality, it was far smaller than the quarter it occupied on early world maps. For the remaining 3 quarters, which are not being considered here, Ptolemaic geography was often preferred, blended in with elements from medieval mappa mundi. The history of world maps in the long period 1440 to 1570 shows a clear choice between the Ptolemaic and portolan chart versions. An analogy would be that of a car, whose body could take numerous forms, but whose engine had to be either petrol or electric. There was effectively no other option in this case here. But that did not mean that the divide was complete. Some open-minded map makers were clearly in doubt as to which was best and followed both systems. One chart maker, the Venetian Andrea Bianco, found house room in his atlas for 2 world maps, the standard Ptolemaic version and a circular map incorporating the portolan chart's outlines, as well as a general reduced size portolan chart. However, a century before, an unknown chart maker had included a portrait of Ptolemy as Rex Ptolemaeus. And if you'll see here the instrument that he's carrying, there is something very much like that in the museum exhibition here. In the opposite direction, or at least one otherwise Ptolemaic map, reproduce the portolan chart outlines where it could. However, a century, have we done that? Sorry, okay. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. Ptolemaios we had, okay. In the opposite direction, at least, one other reproduced the Portias, either way could. Dating no later than 1438, this map by a copyist is preserved alongside a text by a predecessor of Ptolemy. Let's go back one on that. A predecessor of Ptolemy. Since it may be the earliest instance of a Ptolemaic world map, unconnected to the Geographia, it has double significance. In an attempt to understand how the choice between Ptolemy and the portolan chart might have been approached, we need to look at the reputation of the versions on offer, and that in turn takes us back to their very different origins. These could hardly have been more contrasting. To take first Claudius Ptolemaeus, active in Alexandria in the 2nd century of our era, his maps were probably not drawn by him, but constructed around the 12th or 13th century from his lists of astronomically determined latitudes and longitudes. And when the maps came to be drawn out, the reference points on the coast provided fixed positions around which to draw in the coastlines. Now, for many areas, this worked adequately, although North Africa has been identified already as an exception. But knowing the location of neighbouring places does not reveal the configuration of the intervening coastline. Nevertheless, the unquestionably mathematical basis for the Ptolemaic maps harmonized with the Renaissance's veneration for classical knowledge. The reverence for the Ptolemaic maps and respect for their scientific basis would have delayed their necessary reassessment and eventual rejection. The portolan charts, by contrast, have no known provenance. There is no written account of the chart's birth. Indeed, the first brief references to them date from around the time of the Count Pizan, 1270, when the portolan chart could have originally been in existence for 3 generations already. Given this lack of a pedigree, there was no available explanation of how the charts had been created or by whom. This must have made it difficult for viewers to assess their value and hence to trust them. The question of the portolan chart's origin has exercised researchers for many years. Recently, I published a long essay which built on what seems to be a growing consensus that the only realistic source could have been pelagic pilots. My thesis argues that they would never have ventured out of sight of land without knowing where they were heading, and what lay beyond the horizon. Hence, deep-sea navigators must have developed a mental map of the Mediterranean, which was at some point downloaded as a drawing. The end stage of the necessary refinements to the chart's geometry is visible in the treatment of Italy and the Adriatic. If that theory is generally accepted, it would fit well with a further proposal, namely that the portolan chart outlines would never have been introduced into world maps unless they had had what we would call influencers. And the only candidates for that role would have been the successors of the chart's creators, namely pelagic pilots. By the 15th century, it is unlikely that mariners any longer carried a functioning mental map, since ready access to a portolan chart would have removed the need for much of that memorized knowledge. But any pilot could have assured a landsman, based on their own sailing experience, that the charts were dependable. It is worth stressing that nobody other than a pelagic sailor could have testified both to the overall realism of the portolan chart and, simultaneously, to the distortions of the Ptolemaic coastal outlines. Just consider that for a moment, perhaps. Two consequences flow from these dissimilar beginnings. First, the outlines derived from the two protagonists remained broadly unchanged. In the case of the charts, that was because they served their purpose adequately, and the pilots, the pilot users, had neither the inclination nor perhaps the skill to introduce improvement after about 1330, as shown above. In the case of Ptolemy, leaving aside the Atlantic coast, removing errors would have required systematic recalculation of the geographia's coordinates. The second consequence refers to the different milieu of sailors and landsmen. This was probably crucial in delaying the general introduction of the portolan chart lines into world maps. Increasing distance from the sea would have reduced the chart's influence and, indeed, the likelihood that a chart would have been seen at all, let alone that a pilot would have been available to endorse it. And moreover, the centres of learning and later publishing were to be found in the universities of inland cities rather than ports. Hence, it is not surprising that the first printed world map to include the portolan chart information is thought to have been one produced in Venice in the 1480s. Since Italy, the chart's place of origin, was a highly maritime-oriented region. On the other hand, two works produced in landlocked Nuremberg in 1492-3, the Behaim Globe and the Nuremberg Chronicle, preferred the Ptolemaic outlines. Yet Martin Behaim had spent much time in Portugal, had voyaged to West Africa and lived in the Azores. Evidently the city fathers who financed his globe were not ready for the novelty of the portolan chart. A further significant consequence of the portolan chart's undocumented origin and lack of any written exposition meant that mapmakers had to adopt or reject the chart's geography in its entirety, albeit in a simplified fashion. And I'm not aware of a single instance where the chart's outlines have been edited or improved. By contrast, Europeans could see Ptolemaic distortions in the shaping of their own countries in a way that would not have been possible when viewed by Ptolemy from Egypt. What we can't know, while we can't know the reason that mapmakers decided to follow a portolan chart, or more often a simplified copy of one, but there are instances where the cartographer produced alternative world maps showing the Mediterranean region in either style. Bianco in 1436 has already been mentioned, but three other instances are of interest. There are a number of extant world maps made by Henricus Martellus Germanus. It seems that just one at Yale University is of the Ptolemaic form, whereas the others incorporate the portolan chart details. None of them is reliably dated, but it is the opinion of Chet van Duzer that the Yale example, a wall map where the others appear in an isolario volume, is possibly one of his later productions. And I apologize for the poor quality of this and other close-ups of large maps. If confirmed, that would contradict the natural presumption that Martellus has started with the Ptolemaic outlines and then abandoned those in favor of the portolan chart version. I've just missed. Yes, I'm sorry, I missed that slide there showing the contrasting details. For the other two examples, however, it is clear that a change of mind had taken place. Moving on 2 decades, Martin Waldseemüller produced 3 world maps, of which the latest, his 1516 Carta Marina, showed outlines closely copied from a planisphere similar to Nicolai Caverio's of a century earlier. Although his 12-sheet wall map is rightly celebrated, it could have been seen by relatively few people, whether it hung on a wall or was in volume form. The lack of influence from the 1516 map can be seen decades later in a 1564 wall map by Ortelius, which preserved the Ptolemaic outlines. But not long after that, however, Mercator, who had also followed Ptolemy, made plain in his great wall map of 1569 his preference for the portolan chart outlines. Crucially, his own and Ortelius's world atlases disseminated those marine outlines to the wider world over the next half-century. The portolan chart outlines had finally become the default version for Western cartography. The fact that the portolan chart is skewed anti-clockwise by some 9 degrees is usually commented on in mathematical terms, and instead the focus here will be on the unintended consequences of what, as Greg has pointed out, was not an error, but rather a reflection of the position of magnetic north in the 13th century. Now, first, 2 general points. The tilt is usually described as placing Gibraltar on the latitude of Alexandria when it should have been Iskenderun, but in other words, the full length of the Levant coast to the north. In fact, there were a number of variations, as shown here, with their approximate positions. And secondly, the correction of the tilt by aligning with north, astronomical north and not the magnetic pole, did not happen once and for all, but rather, without obvious reasons, on several different occasions. The first remedial action seems to have been taken in the 1520s in the Casa de Contratación in Seville, perhaps by Diogo Ribeiro. But on the portolan charts, however, it was not until the last quarter of the 16th century that the change started to be made. But the tilt can still be seen years later, decades later, as above. Now, that the magnetic pole moved unpredictably would have been known to mariners who made the necessary adjustment, but it became a major, if unappreciated, problem for others. Once latitude scales were introduced at the beginning of the 16th century, the horizontal line in the compass network of a portolan chart was incorrectly treated as a fixed parallel of latitude. As a result, the overall geography was skewed. Now, what had now become a genuine error might have made no difference to most map users, but it would have compromised the Euclidean accuracy sought after by serious cartographers. That the portolan chart survived for centuries, I would contest, can be attributed to one single factor: the fact that the use of copying technique that faithfully preserved the coastal outlines. Shima Krtalik refers to this in her recent groundbreaking Imago Mundi article as bridged copying. Here, the quote, "The model and copy are linked not merely by the gaze of the copyist, but also by actual procedures or physical devices," close quotes. With that in mind, we return to 2 of the maps mentioned earlier and consider the implications arising from the ways they might have been copied. The Sanudo map will be considered in 2 pairings. First, the 2 oldest examples, both in the Vatican and evidently close in date, Might one of them have been directly reproduced from the other, or merely copied carefully by hand and eye? Though there is no doubt about the authorship of those maps, but there is doubt about the authorship of those maps. What were the respective roles of Marino Sanudo and Pietro Visconti? But they do appear in bound volumes of Sanudo's thesis, which also includes the standard suite of Visconti's portolan charts. But when the earliest version of Sanudo's map is contrasted to one of the half-dozen later examples, the picture could hardly be more different. Evidently, the copyists involved had minimum skill and little concern about creating a faithful copy. When the evident lack of oversight is added to that, it is clear that neither Sanudo nor Visconti could have been involved in the reproduction process of these later debased examples. Returning to the various versions of the Martellus world map and making allowance for the different treatments of Africa, and I have to change what I was going to say here because the right-hand one is actually in the exhibition, and Shima has shown the way in which it was reproduced. So clearly the answer is that these two would have been done in a direct way, not in any sense by freehand. There were several reasons that it took 3 centuries for the portolan chart outlines to be confirmed as the best available depiction of the coastlines they covered, supplanting Ptolemy. Ironically, while the copying skill of the practitioners allowed the portolan chart to flourish for so long, it was the difficulty experienced by others when copying a chart that helped delay the spread of its outlines. Now, this is a list of 8 other reasons that I have identified for holding back the portolan chart, and you may have further ones. First, the lack of written endorsement meant that only open sea pilots had the knowledge to champion the chart's realism against the shortcomings of the revered Ptolemaic geography. Calculation over observation. The learned would naturally have chosen the scientific geography of the ancient world over marine charts used by uneducated artisans. Ptolemaic geography became the default option, but the portolan chart was an interloper. The divide between marine concerns and a land-focused outlook meant few portolan charts would have reached the main map production centres. Whereas the Ptolemy Atlas had been circulating since at least the 14th century, the portolan chart outlines were not popularized in a world atlas until Ortelius, 1570. On several occasions, the portolan chart's outlines were adopted, but then not repeated. The large format required massive reduction and mathematical skills for reuse in a world maps of modest size. And away from the rigid discipline of direct replication in the portolan chart atelier, hand and eye copying led speedily to unrecognizability and futility. By looking outwards to the portolan chart's second life, away from the sea, we can appreciate how they slowly progressed from being merely a tool for mariners to become accepted as the best available geography of choice for land-based European map makers, and hence for map users generally. And as the last slide, this is a tribute to our shared subject, with the carte pisane alongside a successor from 4 centuries later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony, for a wonderful overview of our subject. Good grief, Can you please perhaps speak
very clearly,
yes.
like this? Okay. Tony, thank you so much for this talk. I had never reflected on the fact that the lack of a textual pedigree could have had this role, and it's a very good point. Two questions. No, one question and one comment. Is the article where you go deeper already published, or when will it be out?
Hang on, excuse me, I could have done something I should have done earlier. Just oops. Right. Yes, I apologize. Now, I think I can probably hear better now. So can I have the question repeated? Sorry.
Yes. Shima, can you say it again, please?
It's my fault, not yours.
Okay, the microphone's not working. I'm going to shout. Can you hear me?
No, it's my ears aren't working. Sorry, my defective ears.
The microphone isn't either.
Yeah.
I'm going to get another one.
The second question was...
Não está a funcionar o microfone.
Este aqui.
Olha, agora já dá. Mas não está.
Oh, not the orange one. You mean the one I'm working up for?
Yes.
Which,
Yes.
well, it will be published like the origins essay. It'll be published on my my own website.
Okay. And I have a comment. The comment is we should talk about the Vatican world map of Sanudo Visconti, because I looked at that and I think I have info for you that you might want. Thank you, Tony.
Okay. Thank you for that. I certainly will bow to your...
Thank you very much, Tony. I would like to leave a note on a close related subject, which is the coexistence between the Ptolemaic cosmography, the Ptolemaic view of the world, with the results of the maritime exploration during the early 16th century. When you look at the Indian Ocean, you see on some charts the coexistence of both. For example, there is an anonymous chart attributed to Pedro Reinel, circa 1517, after the Portuguese had arrived to the Moluccas, where a pretty good representation of Southeast Asia coexists with the Great Gulf of China in Ptolemaic maps. Also, even more exciting, in the chart made by Nuno Garcia de Toreno after Magellan's mission, Nuno Garcia de Toreno relied on direct information from the Spanish navigators who crossed the Pacific. The Great Gulf of China, preventing people coming from the west to get into the Indian Ocean, is still there. This is just to stress the authority of Ptolemy even after the direct experience of mariners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Can I butt in and ask about the reason why, not the delay, but the reason why we moved to the portolan chart being incorporated into world maps? And I got the point about influencing, but when it actually moves lock, stock and barrel, not just in the manuscript arena or even in the printed arena, when it moves lock, stock and barrel, is it perhaps because Mercator himself is the authority that means that people look to what he has done and therefore they decide in the land map realm he has done. So you have to wait to him as the authority to actually decide to do it.
Well, yeah, I certainly think that Mercator was the. I mean, there have been, if you like, maps before that which had incorporated the portolan chart. But as I said, it fell away again. It was invented and reinvented and reinvented. So Mercator's reputation, I suppose, but one could put it that way if you like, that Mercator, as it were, they're kind of outranked Ptolemy by that point. And of course, one has to remember that 10 years later, Mercator produced, the defining tribute volume of Ptolemy. So I mean, it wasn't that he Mercator in any way, was disparaging Ptolemy, but I mean, it's simply that he was right for his time, but then that they were able to they had anyway to improve the maps because of the Portuguese. I mean, Africa, of course, comes very early. I mean, indeed, the not immediately, but the mirroring of the gradually emerging African coast was something which did usually pushed us out the southern continent. But Joachim's right that there still was at least one example where that was retained. Yeah.
So thank you, Tony, for this presentation. I had a question because I clearly understand for the 15th and 16th century there are these two models of Ptolemaic and portolan chart coastlines. But for Marino Sanuto in the early 14th century, I'm not sure he had access to the geography of Ptolemy. But so in that world map, when he and Visconti added the portolan chart profile, what was it competing with? What would be the alternative profiles that one would have expected in that world map?
Well, I mean, my understanding of my perhaps simplistic view of it is you divide off the portolan chart, what I call, the region that was covered by the portolan chart, which naturally, on the Sanudo map, is from Visconti. But I mean, otherwise, there was nothing. I mean, the portolan chart actually didn't offer anything about what was to the east. I mean, the Catalan Atlas, I don't think, was making a particular pretense to be a new geography. I mean, or new outlines. Yes, a geography, not new outlines. So again, it is much easier if you're copying things to copying them in their entirety. I mean, if you're going to start picking and choosing and so on, that implies a deeper understanding and skill and motivation. And so I think that's really why, as I said, it was a the car is going to be either petrol or electric. I mean, you can't have a hybrid. Perhaps you could. Anyway.
Actually, yeah, maybe my question is about that. In the 14th century, was there another powertrain? Aside from petrol and electric, I'm thinking of some type of medieval mapamundi shape or Arabic world maps or something.
But I mean, I think will you agree with me about a kind of an outline, and then the outline would be the part covered by the portolan chart, and then what happened beyond that? I did suggest that it would be Ptolemaic or some form of medieval cartography, which itself was, of course, very varied anyway.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's a subject that I'm also looking at and debating because it's not easy, I think, to understand this subject, and you did it brilliantly and raised many questions. I love the last slide with the reasons. I took a picture, and I'll be waiting for your paper. I think this is a very interesting subject that is raised in the 15th and 16th century mainly, when the geography, Ptolemy, and here I think it's really, we need to make a difference what is the geography of Ptolemy? I think it's two things. One, the theoretical part, and the other, the list of longitudes and latitudes. I think that immediately cosmographers or people that were thinking about these subjects, and we can discuss why. I think it's a stress factor with the discoveries. Of course, they need to understand and to they start thinking about this in a scientific way, and they immediately understand that the list of coordinates, it's no good when you compare that with the portolan charts and with the information that is being collected from the navigations. They understand it immediately. And then the theoretical part. The theoretical part, they understand, I believe, that that's the path, that's the way. You need to have maps with longitudes and latitudes. And this is the two, I think, the two paradigms that are clashing, mainly during the 16th century. So cosmographers know that they have to make maps with coordinates, and then the best information is from pilots and from the navigations. So they need to get this solved. And Pedro Nunes again. Pedro Nunes, I'm sorry, I'm boring people with Pedro Nunes. The first time he writes about it, 1537, we must recall that he includes a translation of Ptolemy theoretical chapters of the geography. And of course, he knows that the coordinates are no good, so forget about it. And he's debating with that, and he's saying, oh, we have the Portuguese collecting information, and Ptolemy is the best theoretical frame, so what are we going to do? And this is very interesting, I think. I loved your talk. You raised much more questions than answers, so thanks again.
Host and organizer and everything else. Joachim, please, the floor is yours, as
Not yet.
continental friends always say.
I have to leave this. Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. This is a Portuguese polar chart of the southern hemisphere kept in Istanbul, Turkey, depicting the shores of Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. At first sight, it doesn't look very exciting, does it? In fact, the manuscript is not particularly beautiful. Half of it was ripped off, and it is in bad shape of conservation, barely allowing the geographical names to be read. Despite all these apparently negative attributes, this chart is a unique monument in the history of cartography and maritime expansion, and has raised the interest of many historians since Marcel Detombe called the attention to it more than 80 years ago. Two main reasons justify its historical importance. Firstly, it contains the earliest known depiction of the southern part of South America, made shortly after the fleet of Ferdinand Magellan visits the region in 1520. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, it is the earliest known example of the use of astronomical longitude measurements in a nautical context. By the time it was made, longitudes were irrelevant for the practice of navigation and were not considered in the making of nautical charts. In fact, more than 2 centuries would pass until they start to be routinely determined on board, and charts were constructed using geographical coordinates. In this paper, I propose to contextualize this chart within the mission of Magellan and Elcano, as well as with the discussion that were held after the voyage between the representatives of the Portuguese and Spanish crowns over the possession of the Spice Islands, the Moluccas. Some of you will question why am I calling this representation a chart, although it was not obviously intended for navigation and adopts a map projection which is alien to nautical cartography. Two main reasons: because its geographical information was entirely directly copied from nautical charts, and the graphical conventions in the depictions of the coastlines and names mimic those of nautical charts. In other words, this map talks the language of nautical charts. The chart depicts the southern hemisphere in a polar azimuthal equidistance projection and is drawn on a square sheet of parchment. The presence of an unbounded margin with a large tear on the left, where two cut legends can be seen, the brown squares, reveals that the original consisted of two hemispheres placed side by side, of which the northern one was ripped off. The chart represents the southern shores of Africa and South America, as well as the southern archipelagos of Southeast Asia, between Sumatra on the east and on the west, and the little east of Seram, Indonesia on the east. The comparison of this representation with contemporary nautical cartography indicates that, with the exception of the coast of South America to the south of Rio de la Plata, all geographic information was copied from Portuguese prototypes. This is to be expected regarding Africa and Brazil, given that those regions were contained in the Portuguese hemisphere under the terms of the Treaty of Tordesilhas. Along the western side of South America runs a long legend in red reading. Esta tierra descobriu Fernando Magalhães. This land was discovered by Ferdinand Magellan. However, only the eastern entrance to the strait is depicted. I don't know if you can see the mouse. And no passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans can be seen. This means, as I will explain later, that the representation of this region was based on information collected before Magellan's fleet reached the Pacific Ocean. Also noticeable is the presence of the Malvinas, Falkland Islands, rightly placed at about the same latitude as the entrance to the strait, arguably the first known representation of the archipelago. The charted area is enclosed by a circular equator graduated from 0 to 360 degrees of longitude, subdivided in 1 degree intervals. On the top of the chart, the reference meridian cuts through the island of Seram, Indonesia, and passes exactly over the southernmost of the traditional 5 Spice Islands, Backam. This is obviously the eastern demarcation line of the Treaty of Tordesilhas, which divided the world into hemispheres of influence, the Portuguese on the left and the Spanish on the right. The orientation of such a line exactly along the vertical axis of the chart reveals its central importance on this representation. Moreover, and consider that the remaining 4 islands of the Moluccas, all in the northern hemisphere, lay a little to the west of Backam, one can infer that the archipelago was likely represented inside the Portuguese hemisphere on the original chart. The lack of in situ access to the original manuscript and to images of adequate quality explain most of the difficulties felt by historians in reading the chart and drawing solid conclusions about the context of its production. This led to some disparate theories about its origin, purpose, and dating. Most historians have agreed, however, that this was made by one of the Portuguese cartographers, Pedro Reinel or his son Jorge, based on stylistic similarities with their known works. I was recently authorized with my colleague Shima to examine the chart and take high-resolution photographs of some parts. This has made it possible to read most geographical names, see important details not easily visible with the naked eye, and finally to propose original conclusions about the why, when, how, and by whom the chart was produced. But before going into the detail of our study, a brief historical contextualization is needed. In 1519, a fleet of 5 ships, captained by Ferdinand Magellan, left the Spanish port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda and headed to the coast of Brazil. The goal of the mission was to reach the coveted Spice Islands of the Moluccas by sailing west, since the eastern route was closed to the Spanish explorer by the Treaty of Tordesillas. In fact, Magellan was supposed to overcome 4 different challenges. First, to find a passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific, to cross the largest ocean on Earth for the first time, to demonstrate that the Moluccas were indeed within the Spanish hemisphere, as convincingly asserted by Magellan to the King Charles I of Spain, and finally to return safely to Europe, recrossing the great ocean from west to east. Although these were ambitious goals, knowledge about the world was then far superior to that of Columbus 30 years before, who also had proposed to reach the Indies by sailing west. Ultimately, only the first 2 objectives were achieved, and Magellan was killed in a local conflict without even setting foot in the Moluccas. Shortly before, astronomical observations of longitudes were made by the chief pilot Andrés de San Martin in the Philippines, which placed the regions immediately to the north of the Moluccas within the Portuguese hemisphere. This unexpected news must have been devastating for Magellan. Not only the very purpose of the voyage to validate Spanish claim over the Moluccas was called into question, but also it probably represented an enormous blow to his personal honor, since he sincerely believed that the islands fell within the Spanish hemisphere. Now, we do know that the Moluccas were situated in the Portuguese side. At the time of Magellan, however, the best available cartography, the Portuguese cartography, placed the archipelago more than 180 degrees east of the dividing island line of Tordesillas, that is, within the Spanish hemisphere. The reason for this apparent distortion lays in the fact that nautical charts were then constructed as instruments for navigation, not as depictions of the world's geography. These different purposes would be irrelevant if their geometries were compatible with each other, which was not the case. While geographical maps were made using the latitudes and longitudes of the places according to the Ptolemaic prescriptions stated 14 centuries ago, nautical charts were constructed using the routes followed by ships at sea, which were transposed directly onto the plane of the charts, not correcting for the effect of magnetic declination on the directions given by the marine compass. This was not an issue for navigation, though, which was conducted with the same compass courses used to make the charts. The subject has some complexity and was already explained elsewhere. Here, I will only call the attention to the fact that in all nautical charts contemporary to Magellan, Africa and the Indian Ocean appear significantly displaced to the east, owing to the effect of magnetic declination on the directions measured with the marine compacts, which also affected the longitudinal position of the Moluccas. That is the case of the anonymous Consummate 4 planisphere, which was commissioned by Magellan to the cartographers Pedro and Jorge Reinel to be given to the King Charles I of Spain, on which the Moluccas were placed 5 degrees inside the Spanish hemisphere. Let me get some water. Sorry. When Magellan's fleet arrived in South America, the coast to the south of Rio de la Plata was still uncharted and unexplored by Europeans. The last navigator sent to the region by the Crown of Castile was João Dias de Solis in 1515, who sought to discover the passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. But the navigator and some of his crewmen was killed by the natives while exploring Rio de la Plata, and the remaining 2 caravels of the fleet returned to Spain. Thus, cartography prior to Magellan's mission only depicts the coast down to Rio de la Plata. That is the case of the anonymous chart known as Consummate 4 that we have seen before, completed shortly before the fleet left Seville, and the one included in the Miller Atlas, which was completed around the same date. One of the main reasons for the historic relevance of this polar chart is, therefore, that it contains the earliest known representation of the eastern coast of South America between Rio de la Plata and the entrance to the Strait of Magellan. Rio de la Plata is here, this is Rio de Janeiro, and this is the position of the Strait of Magellan. By the time it was produced, the existence of the Pacific Ocean had been known since 1513, when Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the isthmus of Panama and sighted the great Mar del Sud for the first time. The two most striking features in this representation of South America are the red legend running along the western part of the continent. This land was discovered by Ferdinand Magellan, witnessing the visit of Magellan's fleet, and the depiction of the eastern entrance of what is now called the Strait of Magellan. It is clear from a close examination of the manuscript that no connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean is shown, as only part of the strait is represented. This region was visited by the fleet in October 1520, before the Portuguese pilot Estevão Gomes deserted from the fleet of Magellan with the ship St. Antonio. The absence of such a connection indicates that the chart was drawn before the news of the crossing of the strait arrived in Europe, that is, before Elcano's ship Victoria returned to Seville in 1522. The inevitable conclusion is that the necessary information may only have been brought by the deserting ship St. Antonio. On the left part of this image, the eastern coast of South America depicted on the chart was reconstructed on a square reticules of meridians and parallels, so that it could be compared with the delineation on a modern map, which is represented by the red coastlines. The overlay was made by aligning the demarcation line of Tordesilhas in blue, coinciding with the chart's prime meridian, and all parallels in the two representations. A prominent feature previously unnoticed by historians is the placement the placement of the entrance to the Strait of Magellan on its approximately correct longitudes relative to the demarcation line. That is not the case with the rest of the coastline, though, whose eastern displacement steadily increases from about 3 degrees near the strait to about 10 degrees in the coast of Brazil. Here. And this is the correct coastline. We know from the testimony of 2 Portuguese chronicles we had access to the original data of Andrés de San Martin that the cosmographers observed a sun's eclipse on the 17th of April 1520 while the fleet was wintering in the Bay of Saint-Rolien, which is here, a little to the north of the Strait of Magellan. This, of course, cannot be a coincidence. Given that measuring longitudes along the way was a critical requirement of the mission, San Martin must have carefully consulted the available astronomical tables and identified the most favorable time and place to make the observations. Also, his determination is amazingly accurate, placing the region within less than 1 degree from its corrected longitude. It's some luck involved in these numbers, though. I'm not going to present the numbers, but there is some luck here because the tables were inaccurate, in fact. This represents compelling evidence that the Strait of Magellan was placed on this polar chart according to the longitudes determined by Andrés de San Martin in Saint-Rolien. Maybe, I don't know if I have time, I should make a short note about how longitudes were determined at that time. The principle is very simple and was known since antiquity. All you have to do is to observe, to know the longitude difference between 2 places, is to observe a certain celestial phenomenon, for example, an eclipse, at the 2 places and determine the local time. And there, by comparing the local times and multiplying by 15 degrees, you find the longitudes. Since this is not practical because you don't have 2 observers, there were tables who predicted those same phenomena in certain locations. Okay, I don't have the time to explain more than this. Anyway. Also, the fact that the longitudinal position of the strait and the orientation of the eastern coast of South America approximately coincide with the ones in the Spanish official cartography that followed, except for the bulge north of Rio de la Plata, this bulge, which I will not explain here, demonstrate that Estevão Gomes, the pilot and captain of the Santo Antonio, had access to crucial navigational information before returning to Spain. Not necessarily to San Martin's data, but more likely to cartographic sketches that might have been produced along the way. How this information reached the author of the polar chart is a different matter. For now, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that for the first time, a coastline was depicted according to the longitude of a place determined by astronomical methods. Okay, now for Southeast Asia. Because the surviving part of the polar chart only depicts the southern hemisphere, most regions visited by the fleet of Magellan and Elcano during his southward progression from the Philippines to Timor between March 1521 and January 1522 are not shown here. This includes 4 of the 5 traditional Moluccas, as well as the large island of Halmahera or Gilolo, both situated north of the equator. This image shows the representation of the region between Sumatra, Camatra on the left, on the west, and an unidentified island, Ilha dos Homens Brancos, the island of the white man, in the east. The small island placed exactly on the line of demarcation just below the equator is Bacan, the southernmost of the Spice Islands. The second image depicts part of the region on a modern map, extended to the north as to include the traditional 5 Moluccas Islands. A comparison made with the corresponding depiction in Nuno Garcia de Toreno chart of 1523, completed after the return of Elcano's ship Vitoria to Seville on September 1522, makes it apparent that the sources of the two charts were different, and that the level of cartographic accuracy and detail on the polar chart far exceeds that of Toreno. This reinforces the previous conclusion that the polar chart was not based on information brought to Spain on the Vitoria. Taken together with the general resemblance between this representation and that of the Livro de Francisco Rodrigues, the book of Francisco Rodrigues, circa 1513, we can infer that the cartographer relied on Portuguese information for the drafting of Southeast Asia. But the most exciting detail, of course, is how the southernmost Spice Island Bacan is situated exactly on the line of demarcation. Knowing that the remaining 4 islands are located to the north, as we can see on the right, almost perfectly aligned on the south-north line that runs a little to the west of Bacan, the original polar chart must have placed them within the Portuguese hemisphere. Although this conjecture cannot be directly confirmed, in the absence of the northern half of the chart, we will see how a related piece of information lends it additional plausibility. This evidence is found in a letter sent to the Portuguese King John III in May 1524 from his representative to the Juntas of Badajoz Elvas, where the location and the possession of the Moluccas were being discussed with the representatives of the King of Spain. On that letter, a reference is made to a chart brought from Lisbon, which had been copied from a pattern made by Pedro Reinel, where the Moluccas are placed barely inside the Portuguese hemisphere. According to the same document, the chart was made for the deceased King Emmanuel I, who died in December 1521, and was not used for navigation. All these elements, authorship, date of production, and the non-navigational purpose of the chart, match the polar charts too perfectly to be a coincidence. Other fixtures, such as the presence of the demarcation line coinciding with the vertical axis of the chart, and the choice of a polar azimuthal projection, further suggests that the chart was made to facilitate the visualization of the Earth under the terms of the Treaty of the Tordesilhas, probably in preparation for the negotiations with the Spanish crown. Concerning authorship, the name referred to in this letter coincides with the one suggested by the historians. We have studied the chart, Pedro Reinel. If we accept that the polar chart is indeed a copy of Reinel's pattern that was brought to the Portuguese representative in the Juntas, which took place in 1524, we arrive at the interval 1521, 1524 for the completion of the manuscript. A complex issue that still needs to be clarified is the criterion used by the cartographer to plot the Moluccas on the polar chart. Given the millimetric placement of Bacan exactly on the demarcation line, we may be hastily driven to conclude that this was an ad hoc expedient motivated by diplomatic convenience. However, we do know that astronomical observations were made by the Portuguese in the region. In fact, in this same letter, there is a reference to such observations apparently used to prepare some of the charts used in the negotiation. My my conservative conclusion, however, fully justified on an article soon to be published, is that although the results of astronomical observation were most probably considered, the final placement of the Moluccas on this polar chart was artificially adjusted. My conclusions. We have seen why I have considered this chart as a milestone in the use of cartography and science at large. Firstly, it contains the earliest known evidence of the effective use of astronomical determination of longitude on a representation of the Earth produced in a nautical context. Secondly, it is an expressive example of how a scientific stance, the proposed use of measured longitudes to solve the dispute between the Portuguese and the Spanish, could be eloquently presented in cartographic form by replacing the usual projectionless nautical chart with a map drawn in a mathematical projection where the demarcation line appeared aligned with its vertical axis. The Portuguese were making an appeal to authority, the learned ranks of cosmographers and astronomers over the artisanal know-how of pilots and chart makers. It is somehow ironical that this powerful argument was supported by the observations made by a Spanish cosmographer, Andrés de San Martin, on a Spanish mission, and that the Spanish crown continued to take refuge in the Portuguese cartography to support their claims for the obvious reasons. To the question proposed in the title of this paper of whether the polar chart was made as a diplomatic tool or a scientific argument, I am now able to reply that they were both likely within the aims of the cartographer. We could finally ask if, after Magellan and the Elcano mission, longitudes determined by astronomical methods started to be used in navigation and nautical cartography. The answer to this question is an emphatic no. In fact, this unique achievement of determining longitudes during a maritime voyage and reflecting them on a map had little to do with navigation and nautical cartography and all to do with politics. More than 2 centuries would pass until longitudes started to be routinely determined on board, and charts were constructed using geographical coordinates following the construction of adequate tables containing the position of the moon at any time. This development was synchronous with the introduction of the maritime chronometer, which much simplified the determination of longitude, marking a turning point in the history of navigation and nautical cartography. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. I mean, a masterful analysis. I have a feeling that, as you say, the answer is both.
Okay.
Diplomatic and scientific. So, I suppose my question would be, did anybody...
The microphone, please.
Sorry. Did anybody, when it went for the demarcation debates between the Spanish and the Portuguese, did they use this map or not?
I suppose so, because the Portuguese representatives had just got the chart from Lisbon, and though they certainly showed the chart to the Spanish representatives. That was the purpose anyway, as a piece of evidence.
I can add to that because I've studied that junta in detail, and it's amazing how many maps and globes were shared, were compared, and there was a lot of debate. But of course, there was a priority, which was the political. So yes, there were a lot of technical and learned men around those maps and geographical objects. But in the end, their conclusions were invariably aligned with what the respective monarchs desired. So you would always have the Portuguese delegation claiming one thing and the Spanish delegation claiming the opposite.
You are quite right. My interpretation is that the Portuguese were not absolutely sure about the accuracy of those longitude measures. They couldn't be because the tables were not good at all.
It was a good try. Are we having a break? No. Just ask the question. We are having a break. Yes, please.
Normally in diplomatic disputes or whatever of this kind, you would have thought that because probably they didn't want to divide the Moluccas, for example, that's going to make things more difficult. There would be some sort of giving compromise. There would be, you give up something and you take something else, so that it was logical. But how would that would that have been possible in terms of where the line is placed, or was the geography, as it were, something that they were not prepared to compromise on? You see what I mean? The geography, which is actually not going to give you a neat answer.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
There was indeed a compromise, but in the Treaty of Zaragoza, years later, because the Portuguese were proposing to the Spanish to make astronomical observation and longitudes, and the Spanish refused because they say that was a dilatory movement. That was they only they only lose time in doing that. But in the end, the power of Emperor Charles V was prevailed, and the agreement made between the Portuguese of the Spaniards that the Portuguese may kept the Moluccas after paying a large amount of money. That is what happened in the end.
I did, but I thought if we have a moment, I'm sure everyone here has encountered this aspect I've noticed in the 20th century, at least, when I'm reading other historians or talking with friends or whatever, they confuse West and East. Now, I never do, but in print, I notice people often confuse West and East. I'm talking about historians. The Reinel chart you're showing is the fourth example I can think of, manuscript 16th century, which identifies the Tropic of Capricorn as the Tropic of Cancer.
Yes.
I just bring this up so that you'll all be aware to keep an eye out for that. It's a curious feature, but instead of going left, right, east, west, it's north, south.
Okay, yes. This is west, this is east. And the Tropic of Capricorn is wrongly written as Tropic of Cancer in this chart, by the way.
Okay. Is everybody happy now and desperate for coffee? If so, can I ask you to thank Joaquim once again for a masterful analysis and an uncertainty which we all need to carry on with our researches. So thank you very much.